Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. There is a growing amount of discussion among academic scholars and university leaders about an off ramp for the arms race in college sports. Many of my listeners are aware of the escalating costs in college athletics, both for those in the Power Four conferences and everyone else trying to navigate the legal and financial complexities overwhelming almost everyone on campus who cares about college sports. My guest today co-authored a Harvard Law School Journal article that was recently published on this very topic. They are here today to help you understand another way to offer varsity sport opportunities that align more closely with the academic mission of your school. I'll ask them as well about the White House executive order for college sports that was also released last week, and a little bit of an update on the Sports Broadcasting Act that seems to be reinventing itself in this discussion. My guests today are Gabe Feldman, director of the Tulane Sports Law Program and Tulane University's associate provost for NCAA compliance. Gabe is one of the leading voices in the country in the exploding field of sports law. He's also the co-founder and co-director of the Tulane Center for Sport and the host of the very popular podcast, SportsWise. Gabe, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Karen. Great to be back on with you.
Absolutely. And Eric Blevins is a sports law program manager for the Center for Sport, and he is responsible for coordinating academic, research, student, and community activities, including the coordination and implementation of the Tulane Sports Executive Club and other Centers for Speaker Series. And Eric, I suspect you're in charge of this big event you have coming up on Friday. Is that true?
I wouldn't say in charge, but I certainly am happy to have a big hand in it, along with Gabe and some of our other colleagues at the law school and the Center for Sport. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thanks.
And tell us what that is.
So we've got our Tulane Entertainment and Sports Law Conference on Friday and Saturday. It's our 9th edition. We've got over 60 speakers, and we're going to talk about really anything you can think of involving both of those industries and how they intersect with.
Is it available via Zoom or in person or both?
It's only in person, but it's totally free. We're offering CLE credit. We've got free food. We've got a reception with live band. It's a really kind of bringing a little bit of the taste of New Orleans to everybody. So we try to make it fun and not take ourselves too seriously.
It's great. Perfect time of year to be in New Orleans, too. That's great. So let's start off with the paper you wrote. And as I read through it, I picked up three main tracks that I would kind of like you each to talk about. The first one is your proposal is to make athletic participation a 4-credit academic program. Talk a little about where that came from, what that could look like. This is not just your 1 credit extra, kind of lifestyle kind of thing. This is a serious program. So, Gabe, you want to start off on this?
Sure. And the genesis behind this was thinking about how we can potentially reimagine the role of college athletics within higher education and trying to figure out why we have college athletics and why we have these elite competitions housed on these academic campuses and why we're the only ones in the world that basically do it this way and whether it made sense to continue doing it this way. And I think there are lots of different paths we can go. One path that we identify in this paper and that I've talked about in the past is choosing to treat sports like we do other areas of performance on college campuses. So if you look at the music department and theater and dance and performing arts, we don't look at the musician when the musician is rehearsing and say, why are you spending so much time on your music? You should be studying. Music is their study. But when an athlete is practicing for their competition, we say, why are you spending so much time on athletics instead of studying? Or we really look at it as they are inconsistent with each other. They're in conflict, that sports interfere with the educational mission. And I think there is an opportunity to recognize the educational value of athletic performance like we recognize with musical performance in theater and dance. And that individual institutions can decide then what they want to do with it, much like some schools have music departments and music majors, others just have individual music classes. I think there's an opportunity to do something similar with athletics. And why that I think matters so much, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, is that there are lots of university athletic departments across the campus that are trying to figure out what to do with their non-football, non-basketball programs, or what to do with their football and basketball programs too, and
Mhm.
trying to figure out how to make this consistent with everything else that's going on campus. And this is one way to do it. I don't expect that FBS football will adopt this model, but maybe some of the Olympic sports at those schools could adopt this model where we better integrate athletics into academics. We extract the academic value of athletic participation, and we treat it as a serious field of academic study, not to replace college athletics, but to enhance college athletics and to really recognize and formalize the educational value of athletics. So it's more of a conversation starter. Let's get more folks thinking about this. There are lots of people who have done studies on the
Mhm.
academic value of sport. And Karen, I know you're familiar with a lot of them, and a lot of what I've originally written on this is attributable first to Dr. Arian Waite at North Carolina and others who have studied similar aspects. And there are a lot of schools that are now taking this very seriously. I think what our paper does that's different than most of the conversations is it ties it into the legal threats that college sports are facing now from both the antitrust perspective and the employment perspective. But that's the genesis of this idea.
Yeah, and you're right. It has been around for quite some time, and it seems to get to a certain threshold, and then it gets dismissed. Eric, give us a little bit more detail. If I was a provost listening to this conversation, how might I imagine how this might work for my school?
Yeah, so the I think one of the beauties of the model is its flexibility. So the idea isn't to prescribe sort of one kind of rigid formula that schools need to adopt, but really that you can adopt the best model for your school that fits within this overarching umbrella, which is the idea Gabe described, that you're giving true academic credit for athletic performance, for playing on varsity teams, and you're tying that to real, legitimate, bona fide classroom instruction with real professors. So you could adopt sort of a science based model that has STEM type courses and analytics and so on. You could adopt a major within the School of Liberal Arts, or you could adopt an entirely separate school of sport model or a new athletics focused major that kind of is interdisciplinary and ties together the liberal arts or the STEM and so on. So, really, you can take what you're doing already and you can just mold it into something that applies existing disciplines to the study of sport.
And one thing to add to that, Karen,
Yeah.
there I don't think either of us envision just giving academic credit to the football team because they're playing. That's not the proposal. Some have proposed that. That's not what we're proposing. What we're proposing is if you look at what football players do and what volleyball players do, so much of their athletic performance is based on studying film, based on studying playbooks, based on communication. So many skills that we value in academia. And we like to hire former student athletes because they have all these great skills and leadership skills and discipline, but we're not explicitly directly teaching it under a formal academic model. We are relying on coaches to do it, and coaches are incredible at doing it, but they're different than having faculty do it. And we wouldn't allow an credited and just anyone to provide courses in music without them fitting into our broader academic mission and our standards. I think we can do the same thing for sports. So again, no offense to Nick Saban, but the idea here is not that Nick Saban can give you 5 academic credits because he's telling you how to run a particular play or telling you how to run a particular play. This is there's so much learning going on, and football is 95% communication and study, and then 5% physical performance. And let's try to extract and formalize the educational benefits that come from that 95%.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that, and I can talk with some authority because I at one point was going to be an exercise physiologist. So I understand how important, the physiological part of this, understanding how your body functions, what happens when it gets better nutrition, when it gets better sleep. We can understand that. But there are other fields that are exploding just as much. So Eric, give us an idea of how the courses we currently have might incorporate this idea.
Yeah, it's a great point. and to take that and add on to what Gabe said, there are some existing courses out there, for example, on leadership in sports and things like that. But this model is really so much more than that. There is so much more value to be extracted from athletics than leadership skills, which are great, and that's part of it. But there's so much more. For example, last summer at the Center for Sport, we held our colleague Tess Belt hosted a volleyball camp for local volleyball players and brought in math professors to talk about the analytics side so that players can study their own statistics and their own performance and apply these very serious math principles and analytics principles to their performance. So it's studying math, it's studying the same sort of ideas, but it's applying them to what they're actually doing. So they're better athletes and they're better students. So we think that there's really a lot of, like I said before, STEM and science, really serious, rigorous subjects that can be part of this and not just some of the other, I guess, leadership type courses that have come under some criticism, but it's other things as well. It's psychology. There's an enormous body of existing scholarship on psychology in sports that I know you're aware of. It's also you can have study of playbooks, and how you read and process and learn plays just in the way that you learn other subjects. So I think it's a lot more than kind of soft skills. There's some hard math and sciences as well.
I couldn't agree more. I can't believe how much I'm reading about how much AI has accelerated analytics. And this is taking it to a whole new level. It seems like every day I read about the NFL and Major League Baseball just upping their game on what they're asking AI to do and produce when it comes to analytics. So, would you imagine that each team would be its own comprised class studying each one of these topics, or would they be merged in with other students?
So I'll give you one answer, and I think it's up to individual academic
Okay.
institutions to decide how they want to do it. If we are going to do this in a way to get broad buy-in from faculty, which is not always easy to do if you're trying to make any change, but 50 years ago, people didn't want to have music and theater and art as part of academia, and experiential learning was not something that most people on campuses were in support of, and receiving credit for things outside of the classroom, and the world has changed, and our view on what is worthy of academic credit and academic focus has changed. And so what I don't want this to be is something that is only available if you are an elite athlete. I don't want this to be treating athletes different than other students on campus. I want this to be treating all students the same. And just because you're happens to be playing a sport versus playing an instrument doesn't fundamentally change why you are on campus. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you can't be a professional musician who spends lots of your time doing gigs and getting paid and it's not connected to class, just like you might be an FBS football player that's out there and it's not directly connected to academics, and in some cases might be interfering with it because of travel demands, practice demands, whatever it might be. But I think there is the opportunity for, even if it's football, maybe at the FCS level or the group of six level or whatever it might be, to say, let's offer a class that studies athletic performance. And as long as there is some organized sport that you are playing, whether you're playing on the varsity team or a club team or maybe even potentially an intramural team, I want this to be accessible to all students on campus. And then there could be advanced courses, just like in music, you would have the intro class that pretty much everyone on campus can take. And then if you want to take the more advanced courses, well, then maybe you have to be in the orchestra, maybe you have to be in the band. But if we treat it differently than music and theater and dance and English and science, then I think we're going to keep getting resistance from faculty. And if we want buy-in, I think we really have to change the way we approach this. And some might say, no way, I don't want to do that. I don't want to change the way we're running athletics, while so many schools now are reevaluating their priorities and are forced to rethink why they are running these college athletic programs on campus. There, I think, could be some schools who say, yeah, let's try this and let's see if it works. It's not going to hurt us, and it might provide lots of benefits not only academically but also legally in
Mhm.
in maybe minimizing some of the antitrust claims and
Yeah.
minimizing some of the calls for employee status, because although there are some calls for music students to be employees, not as many as there are athletes to be employees. And I think there's a reason there. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons, but the
Okay.
more we can make the student athlete or the college athlete look like the typical student on campus, I think the easier it is to justify a lot of the restrictions that the NCAA and conferences have historically put in place that are now being threatened.
Okay, that's a really good point. Before we get into the legal issues, Eric, I want to ask you, okay, where do I put these classes in my class roster? In other words, do they live in a certain like a general area like science or legal issues or sociological issues, psychological issues, and then faculty members would elect to teach those particular courses? What does that look like?
Yeah. So again, I don't mean to be too repetitive, but the flexibility is the beauty of it. But I think that a model that can work is by creating a new major and a new field of study. And those courses can be cross-listed so that students, like Gabe was talking about, students in other sort of tracks can have access to certain levels of the program, but then the advanced classes, just like with any major, are going to be more restricted and may have a requirement that you play varsity sports. But the science courses could be taken as maybe a general elective for other science majors, maybe in a pre-med track or something like that. And I think that one of the other beauties of it is these classes are really popular. A sports-based class, if you're a pre-med student and I can go get an elective and talk about sports and study these kind of things, I think they'll be really popular. They'll be a draw for students, and they'll also be a draw for faculty who are going to love to teach it. And you're going to be able to, it's going to be attractive in terms of hiring new faculty as well.
And I think just to add on to that, we're not there yet, but I think if we plant this seed and it continues to grow, we could have a sports professor. My brother is a music professor at
Okay.
University of North Carolina. And nobody says, well, what do you mean you're a music professor? What do you teach, the history of music or the business of music? Is it, no, I teach music.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's accepted. So why can't we have the equivalent for sports? But again, it has to be rigorous. It has to be go through the same standards that every other professor on campus does. And I don't think a lot of schools necessarily want to do that, but this is an opportunity to do it for those who I think recognize how impactful sports is, not only from the business perspective, but also from the educational perspective. And as Eric said, how much demand there is for education in sports generally.
All right. So this ties in nicely to many of the conversations that I'm having with college presidents, one on one, two on one, who are saying we know this whole thing is unsustainable. In fact, if the Power Four conferences decide to do a completely commercialized model, we've got to figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do this. So let's talk about many of the solutions, problems it will solve for presidents right now, so they can kind of think through, okay, maybe those are some things I don't want to be exposed to. Eric, why don't you start off with that?
Sure. Well, the good news is that all of the advantages that we just talked about in terms of why this model promotes a university's academic mission are the exact same reasons why that this model gives you more legal benefits. So the antitrust and the labor stuff, you could spend a whole year talking and analyzing it. It gets very complicated. But the long and short of it is really that as college sports has become more of a big business, courts are starting to treat it more like a big business. So when college teams and schools were not making the big money off of it, especially before the television contracts and the media money came in the 1980s, then the schools and the NCAA got a lot more leeway in antitrust and labor law to implement rules. But when the money started flowing in, then all of a sudden those labor and antitrust rules start applying differently. So that's kind of the legal problem in a nutshell, I think. And so where the NCAA has historically gotten deference, and this is what a large part of the paper is devoted to, is for rules that are really tied to educational purposes. So if you have a rule that says students need to be students in good standing, that's really closely tied to education, you're probably going to get away with that. But the further you stray from education and the more it looks like a commercial related rule, the more problems you have. So this model, by taking out a lot of the economic engine, by making athletics not just tied to education, but merging it with education, where it's truly a bona fide, legitimate, rigorous academic field of study, you're cutting out most of the legal criticisms. Now, all of a sudden, all of the rules and the things that you're doing that trip you up under antitrust law have these what are called pro competitive benefits that are tied to education. And under labor law, what you're looking at is, are these athletes doing work that's benefiting the schools, or are they doing something that's promoting their education? Well, the answer to that is pretty obvious from the conversation that we just had with respect to that model. So I think it gets very complicated, but that's how I might summarize it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Yeah. And Gabe, goodness knows nobody's as well versed in all the legal challenges that college athletics has better than you. But some of this will address some of the financial issues as well. Is it more about curtailing the expenses today and tomorrow, or protecting for what might come down the road in this situation?
I think it's all of the above.
Okay.
And I think it is part of the opportunity for, if you're a Power Four school who says, look, we know at this point that football and to an extent men's and women's basketball, and maybe another sport here or there, they're different than the other sports we have on campus. And we need to treat them differently. And I think one of the problems that college sports has gotten into, and the Knight Commission has been discussing this for years, is having one governing entity over all the sports. And that put aside that CFP is not connected or benefiting the NCAA, but
Accept, right?
yeah. So put that point aside, but does it make sense to have the same rules and the same restrictions apply to Power Four football as it does to lacrosse and softball and swimming and diving? Not that any of those athletes don't work just as hard and aren't competing just as hard, and aren't spending the same amount of hours. But if you look at conference realignment, I don't think anyone with a straight face would say that it's beneficial for the Cal softball players to have to travel to Boston to play in the middle of the week. And that's driven by football. And that's okay. We can all acknowledge that. If we acknowledge that, then maybe we can say, all right, let's treat football one way. And maybe they are subject to different rules of compensation. Maybe they're not in this enhanced educational model. But what do we do about everybody else? And how do we make those other sports sustainable? I think this is a way to make it sustainable. You're still trying to compete at the highest level. You're still trying to win national championships, but you are doing it in a way that is more consistent with the educational mission, and all the other schools around you are doing it the same way. So if you think about all the limitations that the NCAA has had in place for decades that are now being challenged and struck down, including the ability to transfer, the time being spent on these sports, those are really hard to justify, as Eric said, because we're treating them like employees. And if we're treating them like employees, well, then they're going to get the benefits of being employees. Or
Yeah.
if we're treating them like another business, they're going to be treated like any other business under antitrust law, which is what Justice Kavanaugh said in his concurrence.
Yeah.
That why should we give them special treatment if they are just like employees or whatever you might call them, laborers at other businesses? And I think this gives schools an opportunity to treat them different and to rein in some of the costs, rein in a lot of the travel, rein in a lot of the pressure that is put on these Olympic sports because of football. And again, to some extent, men's and women's basketball. So if your end goal, and it's one of my goals, is to protect and enhance broad-based opportunities on campus and protect Olympic sports, not just because of the impact it has on the podium, but because we want that participation at the college level and we want it at the youth level. Why? Because athletic participation leads to countless benefits that are well documented.
Yeah.
And we want to expand those opportunities, not limit them. And for schools that are looking for a complete off ramp, this can be an off ramp to say, let's put all of your athletics into this model. For those who want to treat football one way and other sports another way, you can do it this way. And there's been a lot of discussion in the case as well. If football players are employees, does that mean that every athlete on campus is an employee?
Mhm.
Well, if you treat them all the same, they might be, but this is a way to treat them differently and make the lacrosse player look more like the musician. Now you might say, I don't want that. I want the lacrosse player to look like the football player. Okay, you can do that. But here are opportunities in a way that may provide you, as Eric said, additional legal benefits, additional legal protection. And even if you keep losing in court, I would be a lot more comfortable if I were the NCAA going to Congress and saying, look what we're trying to do.
Mhm.
and we're still losing in court. So say what you want about big time football and basketball, but we are really trying to protect lacrosse and swimming and diving and golf, and we
Yep.
can't
Yeah.
because of all these legal attacks. I think you'd get probably more receptiveness from Congress. Not saying that Congress would then magically say, "Oh, you've solved it, Gabe. Now we can go on and give you this law." But I think it at least strengthens the case for these conferences and schools when they go to.
Okay. So, Eric, if I'm a president listening to this thinking, okay, this is a pretty good idea, but the first thing my coach is going to ask me is, do I have to play fewer games? Are my seasons shorter? Do I have to follow the academic calendar? How does all that work?
Yeah, the devil's in the details on all of this, right? So I think that in the big picture, there would be realistically some sort of reorganizing of some school sports, particularly if you're a Power Four school and you're moving your Olympic sports, diving and volleyball to the enhanced educational model. It's not going to make sense to, like Gabe said, be flying Olympic sports cross country every week. You might have different shorter seasons. I don't think you necessarily have to align entirely with the academic calendar. You're taking courses and you'd have final exams subject to an ordinary final exam schedule. But if part of the course requirement is that you complete, your season bleeds into the summer, I don't think that necessarily has to change. I think it would be more the changes would be more geared around economics and probably just making it look a little more like what I think people want, which is that if you're a baseball team, you're going to play and you're in Boston, you're going to play the teams in the Northeast, and you're going to play, but you're going to take bus rides, and it's going to be a lot more like it used to be, and it'll be a lot more cohesive with the academic environment. How does students take tests and prepare for exams when they're on airplane flights cross country all the time? Well, I think there was one story on the University of Oregon. They were taking all online classes, and so you're sort of getting away from that and back to where I think people want to be. And yes, I do think that you will have some changes maybe with the schedule and so on. But if you're a coach, you're still going to be doing your job and your job's going to look very much the same. And I
Mhm.
think particularly outside the Division 1 and particularly outside the Power 4 level, I don't think you're going to have much change in what you're doing as a coach other than you're probably going to be taking off a lot of the things that you hate.
Interesting.
And I also think there are rules on the books that people have sort of forgotten about in this new landscape, including limits on hours you can spend. And I don't remember the last time I've heard
Oh,
a
yes.
para violation or any sort of academic standard violation. And I think there is a lot that if we can just get back to enforcing all of those,
Yeah.
then we would already be closer to the model we want. But if athletics truly becomes part of the educational mission, I don't see why we need to limit the number of games. Just like I don't think we need to limit their number of performances or rehearsals, right? We do what makes sense, both in terms of the competitive landscape, but also the educational landscape. And again, I don't think those things have to be inconsistent with each other.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes they are, but
Yeah.
I would think that the sweet spot is convincing faculty that there's real academic rigor here and
That's right.
convincing coaches that there's still real competitiveness here. And you are still playing at the top level, giving the top resources, competing for championships, and producing elite athletes. Again, I
Yeah.
don't think those two things are inconsistent with
Yeah. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And more to come on this as more institutions consider it. We know there's a couple who are already trying it on campus. I think Southern Virginia University is one of them. So if presidents want to check that out, they can certainly check that out online. I looked at it the other day and I thought it was really interesting. So, two other hot topics that I want to talk about. First is the White House's executive order on college athletics, and it was lengthy. I would say covered a lot of ground. So I'd love for you both to weigh in on what you think might survive, what you think has no chance at all of moving forward. Eric, you want to start?
Sure. Well, if you want to look at what's most likely, Ross Dellinger reported this morning that the NCAA is considering moving the eligibility rule to a pure 5 year time limit from either graduation from high school or when you turn 19, which was one of the key parts of the executive order. I think it's worth noting that this idea, I think, has been kicked around for quite a while. It came up in some of the college sports eligibility cases, but that would, one, it would significantly change the legal analysis of those eligibility cases, and there's a lot of flavors of them. There's actually many different strands, but that would be probably the most likely because I think the eligibility issue is probably the one where folks are closest to a consensus on. Both sides of the aisle, kind of every stakeholder in college sports agrees there's got to be some limits. Just where do you draw the line and how do you draw it? And I'd point out that even goes for athletes. Even in these lawsuits, nobody has seriously argued that there should be no limit at all. That we should have 30 10 years of eligibility with no limits. So even the athletes are agreeing. Every stakeholder agrees, and it seems like folks in Washington, D.C. kind of agree as well.
And Gabe, any thoughts on what you think is absolutely a non-starter from the executive order?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at this. One is the substance of it and what the executive order would like to see happen, like changes to the eligibility rules and transfer
Yeah.
rules and NIL rules. And a lot of that is already contained in either the SCORE Act or other legislation that's been introduced. And then there is, and President Trump has been consistent on this, there is also specific mention of women's sports and protecting broad-based opportunities. But I think the bigger issue is whether any of this could be enforceable and whether the order itself or actions taken in compliance with the order, because the stick that the order has is if you don't comply, you could lose your federal funding.
Yeah,
And at a certain
that's
point,
what was really interesting to me. That's the first time I've seen that tied together. Yeah,
yeah, and I don't know that there's much else the executive order could do in
yeah,
terms of provide teeth because they're not able to make well. I'm not an expert on presidential powers. I'm not an expert on the constitutional issues with the interplay between executive power and the legislative branch. So let me start there before I wade too deeply into this. But I think there's a recognition in the order and the previous order that this is directing other people to do certain things, and whether those are agencies or the schools. And the question is, how do you enforce that if
yeah.
you violate an executive order? And here there is an enforcement mechanism, at least on paper, that you would be denied federal funding, but that could potentially put schools in a position where they have a legal decision that applies directly to them, where there is an injunction in place or a rule has been held to be illegal, but then they're being required to implement that rule under the executive order. You're between a rock and a hard place, or an executive and a legislator, and I don't know who wins out in that case, and I'm not sure what the NCAA does. So or the schools do. So I think there are lots of good ideas in the executive order, like there are in, I think, lots of bills that are out there. But the question is, will this lead to any stability? And if anything, I think at least in the short term, it might lead to more instability because schools might be emboldened to implement some of these rules, as Eric said, Ross Dellinger reported. But judges we've seen in general are not going to say, oh, well, if the president said you can do it, you can do it. And so I think this might lead to even more litigation and
Interesting.
more uncertainty. And I think ultimately the hope might be that this is a strong signal from the president of what he wants to see Congress do.
Yeah,
And what
sure.
we also saw with the issuance of the order was, I don't know, 40 people from across the college sports spectrum coming out in support of the executive order.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so this might be an attempt to kind of get everybody on the same page and say, look, let's get something done. It may not be perfect, it may not cover every issue, but let this be and let President Trump take some credit for what ultimately leads to legislation that does provide some stability, because otherwise we're not going to get stability in the short term. There's a lot of talk about collective bargaining, but there are about 9,000 steps that need to take place before we get collective bargaining. And
yeah,
so if you're waiting on collective bargaining, I think you're better off waiting for Santa Claus, because, well, I shouldn't say that. There might be young kids listening, so let me take Santa Claus out of it.
yeah.
Let's
We
retract
have
that.
tons of young listeners.
If you're waiting on collective bargaining, I think you're going to be waiting a long time.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
so the realistic solution is either start winning some of these cases, change your model so that you can have a stronger case,
yeah.
or get protection from Congress, or just give up on most of your rules. And I think that last one is is not particularly attractive to most stakeholders.
It's a non-starter. And it's important to remind folks, again, executive orders are just one man's opinion about what he thinks should happen, and those things generally tend to die a very slow death by the time that person leaves office and the next chief executive comes in. So this is not by any means has the rule of law. It's just a starting point for those things. All right. All of a sudden, I'm hearing a lot about the FCC, the NFL, Sports Broadcasting Act, and the fact that so many platforms are bidding on these particular games. Like, I can't imagine Thursday Night Football not on Amazon anymore, but now everybody wants Thursday Night Football on Amazon, which forces viewers to pay to watch games that they originally were given for free in exchange for this antitrust Sports Broadcast Act. So, Gabe, if you could just give us a quick summary as to why this is an issue today and why we should be keeping our eye on it, because it could definitely impact the NFL's negotiations. And the next logical one is NCAA sports and the food chain.
Yeah, so I think there's a kind of a confluence of two forces here.
Yeah.
Just a very quick and dirty background on the SBA, passed in 1961 at the behest of the NFL primarily and other pro leagues, because they wanted to be able to pool their TV rights and then share that revenue. Because at the time, the NFL was very forward thinking and said the only way that this league survives is if all of the teams are strong. And the only way all the teams are strong is if we are able to share our revenue. And the way we share our revenue would be through this TV deal that then gets divided up equally. And Congress said, among other things, that yes, you are allowed to pool your national TV rights. And in the NFL, that's the only TV rights there are. There are no local TV rights. So you can pool your national TV rights. That will be protected from antitrust attack. They had earlier lost an antitrust suit in the fees that would have forced the teams to basically do their own individual negotiations. And Congress said, no, it makes sense for you to be able to negotiate as a league. And we will protect that from antitrust attack as long as it is on sponsored television, which at the time was really the only type of television, which is broadcast television, which is free television, where the programs are paid for by advertisers, not by the consumers. We get to watch for free. Advertisers pay for the program. Now, over the last 60 years since the passage of the act, we've seen a move further and further away from broadcast television, first to cable, then to satellite, now to streaming. And back in 1961 and in the 1980s, every NFL game was shown on network television, free over-the-air television. Those pooled deals were protected by antitrust law. Now, when you move over to, as you said, Amazon or DirecTV or YouTube TV or whatever the case may be, that's not sponsored television. That's not free over-the-air television. There may be ads, but it's also supported by subscription fees. So we as consumers are paying for it. The Sports Broadcasting Act does not apply to those broadcasts. Courts have made clear on that point over and over and over again. And if you needed any more clarity, the NFL is still involved in a lawsuit that challenged their Sunday ticket package that was originally on YouTube. It was originally on DirecTV, now on YouTube TV, and they got hit with a $4.7 billion verdict because their pooling of these TV rights was illegal because consumers said, I want to just be able to buy a Jets game when I live in New Orleans, not have to buy all of the games. And the NFL package wouldn't allow that. That jury verdict got thrown out by a judge and it's going back to trial. So we don't know what's going to happen there. But as you said, there are lots of people in Congress, the FCC, consumers who are saying, I have to spend a lot of money now to watch all the NFL games I want to. I
And
can't
I
just
can't
watch
find them. I can't find them.
them and then I have to pay for them. And so people are wondering, do we need to continue giving the NFL this exemption when they've moved so much stuff over to pay channels? And at the same time, a lot of people in college sports have been saying what we need to do to fix college sports is to pool our revenue.
Mhm.
And we can't do that without an antitrust exemption because their last attempt to do that was struck down as illegal in 1984 by the Supreme Court. So they are saying, let's just amend the Sports Broadcasting Act and add the NCAA to it, and then we can be protected. But there's a missing link there, and that link is that the Final Four, the national championship game, basketball, was on TBS.
Yes.
TBS is not free television.
People were very upset about that.
Yeah, and a lot of the TV rights come from ESPN and cable packages. And so even if the NCAA were added to the Sports Broadcasting Act, it still would not protect them from
Okay.
antitrust attack for those deals that are on cable, streaming, satellite, anything else like
Okay.
that. And so while on the one hand, we have some college sports leaders and private equity firms saying, let's add the NCAA to the Sports Broadcasting Act, we have people in the FCC saying, let's get rid of the Sports Broadcasting Act.
Yeah. Okay.
When you have both of those things happening at the same time, again, I'm not a lobbying expert or a political expert. That doesn't seem like a recipe for congressional enactment when some people want to completely undo the law while others are trying to add something.
Yeah. It sounds like a recipe for more discussion is what it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, Eric and Gabe, I want to thank you both so much, not only for your thoughtful article, and I'm going to link to it in the show notes so that folks can download it if they want to, but also for your continued interest in promoting this idea that is very worthy of considerations, particularly on campuses that really are wondering, how are we going to be competitive in this new era? It doesn't mean you have to stop winning championships. It doesn't mean you have to drop some teams. On the other hand, it might actually increase your campus spirit, your campus engagement, and also have a real appreciation for how academically focused athletics can be. So thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for all that you do to educate presidents and board members and athletic directors on these very complicated issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I did as well. Thank you.